the times we live in. And so I'm going to try to go through the highlights today. Let's see, where is it? So I'll have to go pretty quickly to get through it. So we probably won't touch on everything, but it's between Nehemiah and Job. She hides between Nehemiah and Job. Esther. Between Nehemiah and Job. And I'll just start in the first chapter, in the first verse. Esther 1:1. It says, "Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia." That's pretty amazing. His kingdom was all the way from India down to Ethiopia on the western continent of Africa. And in my Bible, it says that he's believed to be the king Xerxes, the Egyptian king Xerxes. But anyway, that's a hard name to say, Ahasuerus. But it says, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the citadel, then in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast for all his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him. When he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. Isn't that amazing? He had that huge kingdom, and he brought all of his princes together. They had to travel halfway around the world on foot or camels, and this feast went on for 180 days. That's 6 months. That's a long time to eat, drink, and be merry. And so I'll skip on down to verse 10. I don't think that made it on the recording. That's good. In accordance with the, so in verse 10 it says, "On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Nehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, 7 eunuchs, who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come to the king's command brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him." So they've been partying for 180 days, and then they got this other little 7-day party going, and he wants the queen to come out and model for all of his drunk friends so they can see how beautiful she is. And it's amazing that she didn't want to do that. You know, I can imagine, you know, she didn't want to participate in that drunken revel. And who would want to, if you're not drinking, and who would want to go out there and wade through all these drunken slots and no tell what would happen. But it made the king really mad. So in verse 13, it said, "Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, toward all them knew the law and justice," and I'll skip on over to verse 13. He asked them what to do. Let's skip down. And so verse 16, it says, "And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but all the princes and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so they will despise their husbands in their eyes when they report. King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she did not come. This day the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen, thus there will be excessive contempt and wrath. If it please the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be reported in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus, let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So she was the queen, but evidently she didn't have a whole lot of power with the king except persuasion, because they were saying, you can't let this one upstart woman get away with this, or all the women in the land will will start becoming rebellious and disobedient. And so they decided to remove her, and that's what they did. And so we skip down to chapter 2, and it says, after these things, when the wrath of King Assyria subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be brought before the king. Let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan, the citadel, and to the women's quarters under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let beauty preparations be given them. Then let the young women who please the king be queen instead of Vashti. Let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This thing pleased the king, and he did so. And so he's all set up to get him another queen. And it says in Shushan, the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. And I was thinking how this old king could just have his pick of all the virgins in the land for his queen. Now, whoever gets elected president has his pick of all the people who lied and cheated for him to make his vice president. So it's a little different in word and name, but there's still some of this going on in our rulers today. It says, in Shushan the citadel there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with a captive who had been captured with Zechariah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. So that was Mordecai's dad. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it was, when the king's command and decree were heard, when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Haggai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace into the care of Haggai, the custodian of women. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparations to her besides her allowance. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of women. Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. So here was this faithful Jew, and he had raised his uncle's daughter as his own, and she's basically taken against her will to go be interviewed by the king as a possible position. And you know, what a shock that would be to a family today if somebody came and took your daughter and said, the king wants her. You know, whatever plans she had for her future, or whoever her family had expected her to be betrothed to, didn't matter. If the king called her, that was the deal. Her whole life changed. And she had no say about that. And so it's no wonder that Mordecai was concerned about her and paced in front of the court every day to learn about her welfare. But the interesting thing is that right away, it's talking about this eunuch was in charge of the women, Haggai, and it says the young woman pleased him and obtained his favor, so he gave beauty preparations to her besides her allowance. And then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of women. So, for some reason, this eunuch that was in charge took a liking to her. He gave her maidservants, and he gave her the best preparation, and gave her the best place to stay. So she found favor in the sight of this eunuch, and she was getting special treatment. And the thing that strikes me is, I think all of us have had things happen in our life that we considered unfair, and sometimes you sit around and wonder, well, why did this happen to me, or why did this happen to my family, or any of these things. But we have to understand that God is still in control. I know that this favor that she's receiving is not a coincidence, and I believe that I know that when we're walking with the Lord, He blesses us, and we find favor in all of our situations. And I think it's really important for us to remember that, and when we're walking with the Lord, we come to expect certain things because we know how God is, and we know that He loves us. The first time that I found favor and realized that God was taking care of me, it was a shock. I was amazed. But I came to learn that He was doing that all along. I just was never able to see it before. And then after a decade went by and God took care of me constantly, and I don't mean nothing bad ever happened to me. I had challenges, I had disasters and different things, but the thing is that whatever happened, God walked with me right through it, and He always brought me out successful and well and unharmed and unscathed and better off than I was before. So I've come to the point now where I expect it. When I pray for God to take care of me in a certain situation, I believe He will, and I expect that. I trust Him for it. It sounds kind of bad and kind of maybe braggadocious to say I expect that, but it's not because of what I am. It's because of what He is and what His history is of taking care of His people. So even in a situation like this we're reading about where it sounds horrible, it sounds unfair, the key is that we can know that God is never far away from us. And I think we're, this time we'll see that this is not a lot unlike what we're seeing in the world today. And so Mordecai was smart enough in verse 10, Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to do this. So he gave her that advice, just not to tell them that she was a Jew or any of that thing, just do what she was told. And so it says, verse 12, each young woman's turn came to go into the king Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months of preparation according to the regulation for women. For thus were the days of their preparation apportioned, 6 months with oil and myrrh, and 6 months with perfumes and preparation for beautifying women. Man, that's a long time. That's a year. Poor old king had to wait a year for a replacement. But my thought right away is I might even look pretty good if somebody worked on me for a whole year with beautifying processes, but that's not necessarily true. That's not in the Bible. It says, but it's amazing how long they took. Thus prepared, each young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from a women's quarters to the king's palace. So I guess it was a lot like a Miss America pageant where they all wanted this position, and they could choose their clothes or whatever to try to impress the king. It says, in the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of women, to the custody of Shazgaz, the king's eunuch who kept the concubine. So she would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. Now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, Abihail, who had taken her as his daughter to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Hegai, the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, advised, and Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. And there it is. Esther found favor in the sight of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of the king. So here they start with another feast all over again. These people were really big on feasting. They just finished a 180-day feast. Then it took them a year to choose a king, and now they're having a feast in her honor. So Esther was made queen. She went from a Jewish. They were basically slaves in that country. They had been captured, and she went from basically a slave to the second in command in the whole country. Talk about the power of God. What could have been viewed as a disaster turned into an amazing thing for Esther. In verse 19, it says, when virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as when she was brought up with him. And she's now the king, but she still considers Mordecai her father, and she's obedient. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king of Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the book of Chronicles of the king. So Mordecai was sitting out by the gate, kind of keeping an eye on what was happening with Esther, and he overheard this plot to kill the king. So she told the king the plot was averted. And after these things, let's go to chapter 4 in verse 9. Wait a second. No, chapter 3, and I'll start in verse 1, 3 and 1. It says, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat before all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were with the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. And, so here's an indication, not only did Mordecai take care of his uncle's daughter, which would have been his cousin, I guess, but he refused to bow to Haman. And so we get the idea that Mordecai was he was a follower of God. He refused to bow to Haman. Then the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, why do you transgress the king's command? Now it happened when they spoke to him daily and he would not listen to them, that they told it to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. And Mordecai had told him that he was a Jew. Now when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath. And so it was nice of these guys. They went and spoke to Mordecai daily, saying, you ought to be balanced. And he refused. And so finally they tattled on him to Haman. Today there's a Jew out here that refuses to bow to you. And it's not just bow, it says bow and pay homage. And but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. So, verse 8, it says, Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, There's a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all the other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work, to bring it into the king's treasury. So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hadassah, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, The money and the people are given to you to do with them as it seems good to you. Then the king's scribes were called on the 13th day of the month, and a decree was written according to all that Haman commanded, to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, to the officials of all the people, to every province according to the script, and every people in their language, in the name of King Ahasuerus. It was written and sealed with the king's signet ring. And the letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. A copy of the document was also to be issued to a law in every province, being published for all people, and they should be read, ready for that day. The couriers went out, hastened by the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan, the citadel. So the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. In verse 4 it says, When Mordecai had learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went as far as the front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And so now, Haman, he started off hating Mordecai, but he and his father hated all, and grandfather had all hated the Jews. So rather than just trying to get rid of Mordecai, who refused to pay him homage, he came up with this plan just to eradicate and annihilate all the Jews in the kingdom. And that's a big kingdom. Again, we're talking all the way from India to Ethiopia. So that pretty much would have been all the Jews that were in the Middle East at all. And so when Mordecai heard of this, he was distraught. But what struck me is, if we go back to verse 8, when Haman talked to King Ahasuerus, he said, There's certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of the kingdom. Their laws are different from other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. And our world today is pretty much becoming much like this, because we live in a country where our laws have little to do with the laws that the woke people are coming on. Now they just took away Mr. Potato Head. He's just Potato Head now. He can't be Mr. or Mrs. They got rid of the little green frog on the Muppet. I can't remember his name. Kermit. Because if you it's okay for firemen and policemen and nurses and doctors and people who work for the power company and carpenters to come fix your house, and people who work for the gas company and plumbers and electricians and farmers and ranchers and truck drivers and all these people that haul our gasoline and all these things. It's perfectly okay for them to work during the pandemic. But if you ask teachers to go to work, you're racist. That's what was on the news this week. And if you don't agree with that, then you have a different philosophy. You have a different set of ethics than what the law of the land and the ruler is. And so you can't be tolerated. And that's what cancel culture is all about. More and more, if somebody disagrees with these people, they're to be fired, they're to be drummed out of society, they're to be neglected. Mark?
It's called political correctness.
Yeah, it started with political correctness. And now it's developed way beyond that to this woke thing, and I can't remember what WOK means, but I think it's also an interesting coincidence that this wasn't the king. It wasn't the president. It was his second in command that was behind all of this. And, the president is not coming out directly and supporting all of this. It's his supporters, the media, his left-wing group in Congress and different people. They want to shut down One American News, and they want to shut down Newsmax, and they want to shut down any news agency that's conservative. And they actually tried to pass or did pass a bill to that effect. And but of course, they'll never get it through the Senate, I don't think. My point is that more and more, what the people in urban areas are deciding is proper and fitting is extremely different and contrary to what people who follow the Bible and follow the Word of God is. I notice, a lot of states our state pretty much has to follow whatever the people in Santa Fe and Albuquerque vote for because they're the populated areas. And this week, 5 counties in Oregon voted to try to join Idaho because they're tired of all the left-wing people in Portland deciding their laws and regulations. So and that's happening in Texas, with some of the big cities in Texas and all over the country. And so we're seeing that, the thing that seems similar to me is that it's not just that, well, we'll just tell these people they can't participate or any of those things. It says he wanted to make sure that these people are scattered and their laws are different, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. And he said, a decree be written that they be destroyed. And there's also a lot of movement in our capital to do away with anybody and neutralize anybody that was a Trump supporter. They're still concerned about Trump supporters, and it doesn't bother them that there's 70 million of them out there. That's like half the country. But nonetheless, they want them to be re-educated, reprogrammed, or whatever, or destroyed. And so it's not like nowadays. It's not like they're doing it with swords and soldiers, but I would imagine they would if they could. But they basically just want to make it where you can't work, you can't receive any kind of government benefits. You just be neutralized, and hopefully you go away. So it's not unlike some of the basic concepts that we're dealing with today. And we hear today, we're living in perilous times, and that's true, and all of these things. But the thing is, we don't have it near as bad as these people did. They can come and try to take my guns, or they can come and tell me I don't qualify for this medical insurance, or they can come and tell me I can't work at this or that or whatever. But the thing is that they normally don't chop people's heads off down or kill them with a sword. And so if we get to feeling sorry for ourselves for the struggles that we're in, we just need to remember what these poor people had to deal with in these times, or the people that were enslaved in the time of Joseph, or the time of Moses before they were led into the Promised Land. We don't have it near as bad. We don't have it near as bad as the people did in the time of Jesus, when the Romans, they would crucify anybody just on the basis that the crowd wanted them crucified. And but the good news is that we still have the same God, that He's not changed, that he's watching out over his people. So it amazes me, here's God over all the planet, and here's this huge area from India all the way to Ethiopia, and this one little gal gets taken to be the king's, the queen, but yet God's paying attention because she's finding all this favor and stuff, and yet this great disaster is coming upon them. So it's interesting to see what happens. So right away, Mordecai, he put on sackcloth and ashes, and then it says, I'll skip down to so Mordecai was talking about this horrible thing, and Esther didn't know about it until finally Mordecai got somebody to give her a copy of the king's decree. So in verse 9, 4 and 9, it says, so Hattach, who was the eunuch in charge of the women, returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Then Esther spoke to Hattach and gave him a command for Mordecai. All the king's servants and all the people of the king's province know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law, to put all to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's word. So the king sat in his quarters, and he had a courtyard there, and if the king called you, you could go into him. But if he didn't call you and you went in there, you'd be put to death. And the exception was that is if he decided, oh yeah, I'll talk to that guy, or that gal, he would extend his scepter, and it was okay. You'd be spared. So she's basically telling Mordecai, I can't do anything about this. I can't go into the courtyard unless the king calls me, and he hasn't called me for 30 days. So I don't know what to do about this, So Mordecai told him to answer Esther, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jew from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And it's amazing the wisdom of Mordecai. First of all, he told her, he says, do not think that just because you're in the palace, you're exempt from this. You're still a Jew, and the order's been given to kill all the Jews. Number two, he says, if you remain silent, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. So Mordecai had faith that relief and deliverance would arise for the Jews from another place. He had faith in God. He believed that God would not allow this to happen, even in the face of this official decree. And that's a lot of faith. That's like if the government passes a federal law that they're going to do X, Y, and Z, and come and take your home or take your bank account or whatever, and you say, well, yeah, that's what they say, but I have faith in God, it's going to be all right. And that's basically the kind of faith that we all have to have. We all have to understand that even in the face of calamity and impending doom, that God's still in control. He's paying attention, and relief and deliverance will come. And it can be something personal in our lives, a challenge at work, a challenge getting work, a challenge with our health. It doesn't have to be, a nationwide crisis, but when we come into these crises and we come into these challenges and we get overwhelmed by our circumstances, we can know that God is aware. He was aware of this girl's dilemma. He was aware of the dilemma of the Jews, and he's aware of every hair on your head. So we might think, well, God's not paying attention. I've heard people say, well, God left me for dead. No, he didn't. She's just waiting for you to pay attention to what he's saying. You know, people will ignore God for years, and then when they end up in a terrible spot, they say, well, God's abandoned me. Well, they abandoned God. And, you know, I'd be willing to bet that most people that attend this church get up in the morning, and it's not very long before they have a conversation with God. But there's people all over the planet that they go for months, and they never even think about God. Oh, they might if they see a preacher on TV or something like that, but they're not concerned about what God's will is for their life. Oh, I'll look into that one of these days. But you know, people like the people that serve the Lord, like Mordecai, he believed. It says, and he was not willing to bend, and he was telling this girl, you know, she told him what the risk was, that she would be put to death, and he told her, you know, do not think in your heart that you will escape. He's telling her, well, you know, that's not going to save you. It's risky for all of us. And but he did say that relief and deliverance will arise for the Jew from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And Esther told him to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days or nights. My maids and I will fast likewise, and I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. So it shows that this gal, who was raised by Mordecai, you know, she didn't depart very far from him. She said, okay, I'm going to do this for my people, and if I perish, I perish. And you know, that's a lot of courage for a gal that just lost her whole life, was turned upside down. You know, but now she's a queen, and she's willing to risk it all. So in verse 5 it says, and you know, but the one thing is before she did it, she asked for a 3-day fast from all the Jews, for herself and her handmaiden. So she was seeking God. She didn't just make up her mind, well, I'm going to try this because Uncle says it's right. And you know, that's important, that when we're in these times that we seek the will of God, or it's just not going to be successful. It says 5:1. Now it happened on the 3rd day that Esther put on her royal robe and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house. And the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. So it was, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter, which was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, what do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, up to half the kingdom. It's just amazing to me, this culture. They captured all these girls. They picked one to be queen, but they still treated her like a concubine. I mean, she couldn't come to the king unless he requested, but yet he was willing to give her half of his kingdom. That's a different story, but it's kind of amazing. So Esther answered and said, if it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I have prepared for him. And the king said, bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said, for the banquet that Esther has prepared. So to make this story a little shorter, that was her request, that they have a banquet. In the meantime, so Haman and the king came to the first banquet. And then in verse 9, Haman went out that day joyful with a glad heart. But when he saw Mordecai in the king's gate, he did not stand or tremble before him. He was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home and sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything which the king had promoted him, how he advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, besides Queen Esther invited no one but me to come with the king to the banquet that she prepared, and tomorrow I am again invited by her along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. And so this guy had all of his riches were second only to the king, and he may have had more money than the king, but with all of that, he wasn't happy because there was one guy that wouldn't bow to him, and that was Mordecai. It's amazing how it just shows how the human mind can make a mountain out of a molehill. It's like if somebody owned North and South America and most of Canada, and they had all this money and they had all these accomplishments. Can't imagine what kind of house he had, whatever money could buy in those days. But there's one guy in Georgia that doesn't bow to me when I step out of the motel. and it just drove him nuts. So he said, so he considered all this avails me nothing. In verse 14 it says, then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made 50 cubits high. That's 50 times 6. Man, that's like 300 feet. That's hard to believe. Anyway, in the morning suggested the king that Mordecai be hanged on it, then go merrily with the king to the banquet, and the king pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. So we'll skip over. So he had that gallows made, and in the meantime, that night the king couldn't sleep. So he was reading the Chronicles, and in 6:2, it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigtha and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers who sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Then the king says, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And the servant said, nothing has been done. So when Naaman came in, the king told him about this in verse 7, or verse 6. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman, he's a little conceited, so he thinks, well, if the king wants to honor somebody, surely it's got to be me. I mean, I'm like the best in the land except for the king, and maybe even more than him, but he doesn't know it. So right away, the king asked him, what reward would I give to this guy? And Haman answered the king, thinking it was himself, let a royal robe be bought, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has the royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. So he told the king all this stuff that he would like to have, and the king says, okay, the guy is Mordecai, you do that. So how fitting it is that the guy that hated Mordecai is told to take a royal robe and the king's royal horse and go out and find Mordecai and put him on it and parade him on horseback through the city square and proclaim before him, this shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. So, doesn't God do things in an amazing way? Mordecai's worst enemy is forced to put a robe on him, put him on the royal horse, and parade him around the city, telling everybody how great he is. And then afterwards, verse 12, Mordecai went back to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house mourning with his head covered. It made him sick. In verse 13, when Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that happened to him, his wise men, his wife Zeresh, said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. So, there was a word of wisdom and warning to Haman from his wife and his wise men, saying, if this guy is a Jew, what they were basically saying is, this guy has too much good luck. He's the guy that you hate, and he won't bow to you. And if he might be a Jew, And if he is, he has the favor of God on with him, and you're not going to be able to withstand it. If Haman had been smart, he would have packed up all the gold he could carry and found a boat someplace else. But he didn't listen. But it was a warning. If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. So even non-believers knew that you don't mess with God's people. You know, one of our favorite verses is, you know, God told the Jews, those who bless you, I will bless those that bless you, and I will curse those that curse you. And even people in this country, back when I was young, even people that weren't believers didn't mess with Christians. You didn't have to worry about somebody breaking into a church. They knew better. They knew that God wouldn't stand for that. And I never heard of a church being burned down until the 90s or something like that. It might have probably happened maybe back when Martin Luther King was trying to do his thing in the South, but people, even non-believers, had a reverence for God, and more society is degenerated around the world where there's a lot less reverence for God in a lot of places. But there's also, wherever there is oppression, there's a lot more reverence for God. You know, some of the most sincere and dedicated Christians in the world are in China and some of those foreign countries like that. And what an amazing thing. So in chapter 7, we finally get to the second banquet. And the king asked Esther again what she wanted. In verse 3, Queen Esther answered and said, If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. So the king Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, Who is he and where is he who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? And Esther said, The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king. When the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden, then the king arose in his wrath. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, Will he also assault the queen while I am in the house? As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, Look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. Then the king said, Hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows when he had prepared for Mordecai, when the king's wrath subsided. 8:1, on that day King Ahasuerus gave Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. So the king took off the signet ring which he had taken from Haman and gave it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed Mordecai over the house of Haman. So Mordecai went from a poor Jewish slave in front of the gate to owning the house of Haman and all his riches. And the king gave him his signet ring, and we're about out of time, but so they basically had to do the reverse. They had a decree written that freed all the Jews and gave the Jews the right to protect themselves, and it was distributed throughout all the land. But the amazing thing to me in this story is that, here's an old man raising his young cousins as basically slaves in a foreign country, and they get into this horrific situation where it looks like they're just going to be destroyed. And sometimes in this country, it just seems like all the decent people are about to be wiped out or ignored. But we're not outnumbered, and we're not about to be wiped out. We have a God that is above and beyond all of that. No one is greater than our God. And it's amazing how fast he turned us around. If you saw this decree, if the decree today that anybody without this certain qualification was never going to be able to work for the federal government or whatever, you would think, well, we'll never turn that around, and you hear people say that, and like today, it looks to me like if you can't restore some sort of integrity to our voting system, then I don't see how you could ever have a representative government again. But when I see how fast God turned this situation around, he could turn that around in a day. He could turn that around overnight. Right?
It's like today they're trying to pass laws under legislation to do away with the First Amendment, of the news states to silence them, and then the Second Amendment decree to do away with the right to hold guns to protect yourself. And so the analogy is that they seem to be similar in that aspect.
And freedom of speech is a good example. I hate to keep talking about government things, but it could be anything. It's like if the economy, you get into a recession, those things can last for 10 years or they can last for 3 months. But the point is God can turn that stuff around in a matter of hours. Okay?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the whole thing. The context is that, we have found favor with God because of Jesus Christ. And so the thing about Esther, she was a great intercessor for God's people. And it's like we've been appointed at this time, even though we see all these people plots and all this stuff going on, we've been appointed by God to this time to be an intercessor for God's people. And maybe this country, I don't know, it's up to God, but I think the whole thing is that we've been appointed as an intercessor just like Esther was.
And I'm impressed by 3 things right off the bat about Esther. There's probably 12, but even if somebody like me can pick up on 3. Number 1, she was unselfish. She just lost her future. It didn't matter if she was planning on getting married and having kids or go to college. They didn't have college in those days. It would be like today, you have your future mapped out as a teenager, and all of a sudden the king says, you're going to be a concubine at least, and maybe the queen, but that's not likely. She didn't moan and groan about it. She wasn't concerned that much about herself. And number 2, she was obedient. Her uncle was the authority in her life, and she did what her uncle told her to do. And then number 3, when her uncle, told her that she had this opportunity to save her brethren, and told her the risk involved, she was obedient even to the point of risking her life. And it makes me feel kind of bad when I'm embarrassed to go up and try to talk to somebody about Jesus because it might make them mad. and this gal was willing to risk her life, but like Mordecai, he never quit trying, and he was also obedient and faithful. He refused to bow because the Jews believed that you bow to no one but God, and so he refused to bow to this old king, and he maintained his integrity. There's a lot of Christians today that are embarrassed. They don't want anybody to know they're Christian. I might not get that job if they find out I'm a Christian or whatever, but these people had a lot of integrity and they were obedient. And the other thing is God didn't lose track of them. And I'm just reminded that there's none of us, wherever we are, whatever we're doing or whatever we're not doing, God knows exactly where we're at. He knows exactly what's happened, and He hadn't forgotten. And it's just an amazing thing to know. And like I say, I'm almost embarrassed to walk around telling people, I have the righteousness of God through Christ, and I'm highly favored, and I'm blessed. It sounds like you're bragging, but it's true. God loves us. We have the favor of God. We're blessed, and I don't mean that we have good luck all the time. I don't believe in luck. It doesn't mean that everything goes smoothly for us. It's like Spencer, he's been patiently waiting for God to help him with get his life started and get a job and stuff. Sometimes these things take time, but God's hand is upon him. And I believe God has a future for Spencer and a purpose for him. And I know that. But we have to trust God, and he might not heal that sunburn Spencer's got, but no, he will. But, it doesn't matter who we are, every one of us. It doesn't matter if you're young or those of us that are older. God has a purpose for our life. He has a future, and He's paying attention to every one of us. And when we read these stories, God is manipulating a nation that's bigger than anything we have on the face of the earth right now. I keep thinking of that, from India all the way to the western part of Africa was the size of this country. And God manipulated that country to bless His people. The God that created this world and this universe and all of its magnificence, there's nothing He can't do for His people. And I'm rambling now, so I'll quit. But I just think God is so good to us, and it's such an amazing blessing to be a child of the God of Most High. It's just an amazing opportunity. It's a blessing. The only reason that I'm here and not out there in the dump is by the grace of God. I didn't earn it. I didn't deserve it. There's nothing special about me except that God had mercy. And I just praise Him for it. Tom, would you ask the benediction on the service?
Well, Father God, thank you for parents. I pray